missed her movie and hopes she can come by the restaurant to pick up some food. Chow tells Ha to make steak and fries for Antoinette on the house.
Orleans Parish Criminal District Court, a judge decided that Roger Lacaze will not die for his crimes.
She dumps more than $10,000 on a kitchen table, out of which she grabs some cash to pay Ronnie.
Following decades of appeals, he will now serve life in prison without parole.
Something's wrong with this case.
The evidence supports that he was killed in the front.
Then, the battery dies.
Unveiling a tale of corruption, justice, and redemption, witnessing the gripping story of a corrupt cop facing his ultimate reckoning in a harrowing Demise Row execution. Background and history. Antoinette Renee Frank was born on April 30th, 1971, and is a former officer of the New Orleans Police Department. However, her name became notorious due to her involvement in a tragic incident that took place on March 4th, 1995. On that fateful day, Frank carried out a violent armed robbery at a restaurant in New Orleans. This robbery had devastating consequences, as two members of the Vietnamese-American family who owned and operated the establishment
Missed her movie and hopes she can come by the restaurant to pick up some food. Chow tells Ha to make steak and fries for Antoinette on the house.
Chow locks the front door so no additional customers can enter and drops the key on the bar where Ronnie Williams is holding court.
Chow cleans the bar top, Kwok sweeps the floor, and Ha and Kwong attend to matters in the kitchen.
as well as fellow NOPD officer Ronald A. Williams II, lost their lives in the process. The incident shocked the community and highlighted the gravity of the crimes committed. Frank's criminal actions were further facilitated by her alleged romantic involvement with Roger Lacaze, a drug dealer. The details of their relationship and how it influenced their decision to commit this heinous crime are part of the larger narrative surrounding the case. Subsequently, Antoinette Renee Frank was arrested, tried, and found guilty for her role in the armed robbery and slaying. As a result of her crime, she was sentenced to serve her time at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, located in St. Gabriel, Louisiana. Notably, Frank holds the distinction of being the only woman on Demise Row in the state of Louisiana.
The Vietnamese restaurant is on the far east edge of New Orleans East. 18-year-old Kwok and 17-year-old Kwong work at the establishment, which is owned by their family.
Frank sometimes works security at the restaurant. She's just gotten off duty.
He gives Antoinette a couple of free orange juices and sends her on her way. Then she instructs her siblings to start cleaning up.
This tragic event had a profound impact on the victim's family, the local community, and the NOPD. The loss of innocent lives, particularly at the hands of a fellow officer, created a sense of shock and betrayal within the community. It sparked discussions about the importance of accountability, ethics, and the need for improving training and oversight within law enforcement agencies.
Ronnie can't find Chow's key, so Kwok uses his to let them out and tells Antoinette not to worry about working security the following night because Ronnie has it covered.
She dumps more than $10,000 on a kitchen table, out of which she grabs some cash to pay Ronnie. Antoinette is back.
Even though Antoinette is like family to the Vus.
Police career. Antoinette Frank began her journey in the New Orleans Police Department, the NOPD, in early 1993 when she submitted her application. However, her path to joining the force was not without controversy. According to author Chuck Hustemeyer, Frank was discovered to have lied on various sections of her employment application. Additionally, she failed 2 standard psychiatric evaluations.
The convictions put Lacaze and ex-NOPD officer Antoinette Frank on death row for the last 2 decades.
Orleans Parish Criminal District Court, a judge decided that Roger Lacaze will not die for his crimes.
In the robbery gone wrong back in 1995, WDSU legal analyst Robert Jenkins said the case relied heavily on witness testimony,
with psychiatrist Philip Sukuria advising against her hiring. Despite these red flags, Frank was given a second opportunity to apply. And during this period, the NOPD was facing significant challenges. The department suffered from chronic understaffing, with officers being paid less than their counterparts in similarly sized cities. Moreover, they were losing officers at a rate that outpaced their replacements, and the ranks had been greatly affected by arrests related to slaying and drug activity. Adding to these issues, many potential applicants were disqualified due to a residency requirement that mandated officers to be residents of New Orleans, a requirement that would only change in 2014.
Of an NOPD officer and 2 others at a restaurant. WDSU's Jennifer Crockett has the story.
Following decades of appeals, he will now serve life in prison without parole from court today. In New Orleans, Jennifer Crockett. Roger Lacaze's conviction on 3 murder charges still stands, but his death sentence was replaced today.
In an effort to address the racial tensions prevalent in the majority black city, NOPD officials believe that recruiting more African American officers like Frank could help alleviate the long-standing issues. Antoinette Frank was eventually hired by the NOPD on February 7, 1993, and she graduated from the police academy on February 28th. While Frank performed well academically and graduated near the top of her class, her actual performance as a police officer was largely unremarkable.
The ex-NOPD officer remains on death row at Angola. It's the same prison Lacaze will return to.
It's like a puzzle. You can have a puzzle with 90 pieces. If one missing, something's wrong with that puzzle, right?
Jenkins worked on Frank's case back in the 90s and says Frank is appealing too.
Fellow officers perceived her as shy and inexperienced, lacking a true understanding of the demands of police work. There were instances when her behavior seemed irrational, leading to concerns among her colleagues. As early as August 1993, Frank's superiors contemplated sending her back to the academy for additional training. Her performance often required supervisory review. Despite her lackluster performance, there were sporadic moments when Frank managed to distinguish herself. She received Officer of the Month awards from the local Kiwanis Club for her contributions to the community. However, these accolades were overshadowed by the concerns and reservations surrounding her overall effectiveness as a police officer.
Following today's resentencing, Lacaze's mother says she is not satisfied with her son.
You may recall Lacaze was sentenced to death back in 1995 for the killing.
And the only person in the front with him that the other witness indicated was Mr. Lacaze.
Something's wrong with this case.
So the evidence supports that he was killed in the front.
Relationship with Rogers Lacaze. Antoinette Renee Frank's relationship with Rogers Lacaze played a significant role in her life and ultimately became a central part of the investigation surrounding the tragic events that unfolded in 1995. The initial contact between Frank and Lacaze occurred on November 25, 1994, when Frank responded to an incident involving Lacaze, who had been shot. While an investigator from the Department of Public Safety and Corrections believed this was their first encounter, Frank claimed in her statement that they had met approximately 8 months prior to the demise. Frank initially viewed her interaction with Lacaze as an opportunity to help him turn his life around. However, her attraction to Lacaze's bad boy persona quickly led their relationship to become romantic and physical in nature.
Then, the battery dies.
Kwok volunteers to run to a nearby friend's house and call the police.
911 receives Kwok's call at 1:50 a.m. The dispatcher sends code 108.
Despite being fully aware that this relationship put her career at risk, Frank chose to maintain her connection with Lacaze. The association between Frank and Lacaze became noticeable to other police officers. They observed Lacaze driving Frank's car or witnessed him moving her police unit at the scene of an accident she was investigating. On certain occasions, Frank introduced Lacaze as her trainee during complaint calls, while at other times she introduced him as her nephew. Testimonies provided by individuals before the slaying revealed that Frank and Lacaze would pull over unsuspecting motorists while using their police vehicle and rob them. During the DOC investigation, Frank refused to discuss her relationship with Lacaze, except to state that she was trying to help him. It later emerged that the two were engaged in a physical relationship. When questioned about her decision to continue the relationship despite Lacaze's involvement in drug dealing and a shooting incident, Frank defended her actions, stating that she would never sever ties simply due to his past. The investigator also inquired about Frank attempting to purchase a 9mm ammunition for Lacaze at Walmart on the day before the Kim Ang slaying. Frank justified her actions by asserting her status as a police officer and claiming that there was nothing wrong with her buying ammunition. In her statement, she denied dating Lacaze or having an intimate relationship with him. Additionally, Frank mentioned having a male suitor but refused to divulge further details, mentioning that he worked for the police department. During the court proceedings, testimonies from individuals who attended a party on February 4, 1995, shed light on an altercation involving Lacaze. John Stevens and Anthony Wallace testified that as they were leaving the party,
When they peer out through the freezer window, they can see Antoinette and her nephew frantically running back and forth.
Chow and Kwok watch through the window as Antoinette and her nephew peel out of the parking lot.
Chow creeps into the dining area and finds Ronnie Williams motionless on the ground.
a verbal dispute broke out between Stevens and Lacaze. Wallace intervened and urged them to leave the scene. However, their car was subsequently pulled over by a police vehicle. Frank, dressed in her police uniform, emerged from the SWAT car and directed Wallace and Stevens to exit the vehicle and move towards the rear. It was at this point that Wallace noticed Lacaze holding a gun. According to Stevens, Wallace immediately confronted Lakaze, leading to a physical altercation between the two men. Frank and Stevens also joined the altercation, and during the scuffle, a gunshot was discharged. Stevens managed to escape and flee the scene, but another individual arrived and restrained both Lakaze and Wallace. Frank intervened, informing the newcomer that Lakaze was the innocent party while implicating Wallace as the instigator. Wallace was subsequently restrained until backup units arrived, and he was arrested, facing charges of attempted slaying and armed robbery.
Using Chow's missing key, she heads for the back, pushing Kwok and Chow back from the entrance to the kitchen. When Ronnie moves towards the kitchen, gunshots ring out. Antoinette lets go of Chok and Chow.
They whisper for Kwong and Ha to join, but they're in shock.
Irvin Bryant, a civil sheriff at the time, testified that on the evening of February 4th, he observed a police vehicle with its lights flashing. Initially assuming it was a routine traffic stop, Bryant approached the scene and witnessed an officer and two African-American men engaged in a physical confrontation. As Wallace broke free and ran, he picked up a TEC-9 semi-auto weapon from the grass. Bryant immediately ordered Wallace to drop the firearm, which he complied with and was subsequently restrained. Lakaze then lunged towards Wallace, prompting Bryant to intervene and restrain Lakaze as well. Frank intervened, identifying Lakaze as her associate and instructing Bryant to release him. Despite his involvement in the altercation, Bryant was never questioned by the police, and no formal statement was obtained from him. The complex and questionable nature of Antoinette Frank's relationship with Roger Lakaze raised significant concerns during the investigation. Their involvement in criminal activities, coupled with the influence it had on Frank's behavior as a police officer, contributed to the larger narrative surrounding the tragic events that unfolded in 1995.
She tells the desk clerk she's taking a squad car to respond to the 108.
Within minutes, she's actually the first officer on the scene, back at Kim An.
Restaurant robbery slaying. On the night of March 4th, 1995, Antoinette Frank and Roger Lakaze carried out a horrifying robbery and homicide at Kim An, a Vietnam restaurant in New Orleans East. Frank had previously worked at the restaurant as an off-duty security guard, and she and Lakaze had visited the establishment earlier that night to collect leftover food. However, their final visit signaled something far more sinister. As Chow Vu, a member of the Vu family who owned the restaurant, was counting money in the kitchen, she noticed Frank approaching the establishment. Sensing that something was wrong, Chow quickly ran to hide the money in the microwave. Frank, armed with a stolen key, entered through the front door and swiftly pushed Chow, her brother Kwok, and another employee into the kitchen's doorway. Ronald Austin Williams II, a fellow officer who had been working as a security guard at the restaurant that night, became curious about the commotion and started to follow. Tragically, Lakaze, who had positioned himself behind Williams, shot him in the neck, instantly paralyzing him. As Williams fell, Lakaze continued to shoot him in the head and back, delivering fatal wounds.
And what happened to their other siblings? Confused, Chow responds that Antoinette should know because she was there.
Wayne Farr checks Ronnie Williams, but there's no pulse.
All three officers then escort Chow back into the dining area.
Meanwhile, Chow, Kwok, and the employee sought refuge in the rear of a walk-in cooler, turning off the light as they entered. They were unaware of the whereabouts of their siblings Ha and Kwong Vu, who were sweeping the dining room floors when Frank entered the restaurant. From their hiding place, Chow and Kwok could partially see the kitchen and the front of the restaurant. They observed Frank searching for something in the kitchen and heard additional gunshots. Frank and Lakaze had been demanding money from Ha and Kwong, but they were unaware of Chow's hiding place. In her desperation to locate the money, Frank pistol-whipped Kwong when he hesitated to reveal its location. Eventually, Frank discovered the money in the microwave and proceeded to shoot Ha 3 times as she knelt and pleaded for her life.
Arrived seconds later. Suddenly, Chow Vu runs out the front door in hysterics.
Frank immediately tells Favre that 3 masked gunmen were involved in the shooting.
Officer Yvonne Favre, Wayne's wife, now arrives. Chow jumps into her arms and refuses to let go.
Kwong was shot 6 times. After Frank and Lakaze left the premises, Chow attempted to call 911 on her cell phone, but was hindered by the cooler's interference. Kwok emerged from the cooler and fled through the restaurant's back door to a nearby friend's home to call 911 and report the brutal slaying. Following the robbery, Frank dropped Lakaze off at a nearby apartment complex, both aware that they were witnesses who could identify them. Frank overheard a 911 call on her portable police radio, reporting an officer down at the Kim An restaurant. Seizing the opportunity to eliminate any potential witnesses, she borrowed a patrol car and returned to the scene, posing as a responding officer. Frank entered through the restaurant's back door, navigating her way to the dining room, where Chow anxiously awaited help at the front door. As Chow fled through the front door seeking safety with arriving officers, Frank identified herself as a police officer. Chow tearfully informed the officers that Frank was a perpetrator of the heinous crimes. Eddie Rance, the homicide detective assigned to the case, believed that Frank and Lacaze had planned the robbery as a means of seeking revenge on Williams. Frank harbored resentment towards Williams, suspecting him of shortchanging her on hours and pay at the Kim On. Rance, who described Frank as the most cold-hearted person he had encountered in his 3 decades as an officer, questioned both Frank and Chow extensively. Frank was subsequently arrested and charged with 3 accounts of first-degree slaying, becoming the first New Orleans police officer to be charged with slaying a fellow officer. Lacaze was arrested and charged later that same night. Frank was taken to police headquarters for further questioning, during which she confessed to the crimes, implicating Lacaze as her accomplice.
Yvonne watches in shock as Antoinette walks back and forth all over the crime scene, which is against standard protocol.
And asked Antoinette about the supposed masked gunman. She claims they fled down Bullard Avenue in a dark car.
Chow describes a short black man with gold teeth and says he came into the restaurant earlier with Antoinette.
Trial and conviction. Following their indictment by an Orleans Parish grand jury on April 28, 1995, Antoinette Frank and Rogers Lacaze faced separate trials for their involvement in the restaurant robbery slaying. Rogers Lacaze's trial took place first, from July 17 to July 21, 1995, under the jurisdiction of Judge Frank Marullo. During the trial, the prosecution presented compelling evidence against Lacaze, including the use of Ronald Williams' Chevron credit card at a nearby Chevron station, just minutes after the robbery and slaying occurred. This credit card transaction served as a crucial piece of evidence linking Lacaze to the crime scene. The jury found Lacaze guilty on all charges, and he was subsequently sentenced to demise.
The prosecution asserts that Lacaze is a cold-blooded killer. Officer Ronnie Williams dead at Kim On restaurant on March 4, 1995. They argue it makes no difference who pulled the trigger because both Lacaze and Frank intended to kill in the course of the robbery.
Antoinette Frank's trial commenced on September 5, 1995, also before Judge Marullo. The defense strategy during Frank's trial was unconventional, as her attorneys chose not to call any witnesses to testify on her behalf. This decision was met with surprise and raised questions about the defense's approach. By opting not to present witnesses, the defense left the jury with only the prosecution's versions of events, which likely influenced the swift and decisive outcome of the trial. On September 12, 1995, after a remarkably short 22-minute deliberation,
She points out Rogers Lacaze as the person she saw shooting at the restaurant.
Adam Jr. was her accomplice, not Rogers. Adam has a criminal record, but it's physically obvious no one would mistake.
Lacaze sticks with his alibi and insists he didn't buy gas with Ronnie Williams' credit card, the possession of which is damning proof that he'd been at the crime scene.
The jury delivered a verdict of guilty on all counts against Frank. This record-breaking pace for a capital slaying case in New Orleans indicated the strength of the evidence presented by the prosecution. The following day, after just 45 minutes of further deliberation, the jury recommended the demise penalty for Frank. The speed with which the jury reached their decisions reflected the gravity of the crimes committed and the jurors' firm belief in the defendant's guilt. On October 20, 1995, Antoinette Frank was formally sentenced to demise. This sentence marked the culmination of the legal proceedings and signified society's condemnation of her actions. She was subsequently transferred to Demise Row at the Louisiana Correctional Institute for Women, LCIW, in St. Gabriel near Baton Rouge. There, Frank would await the ending of her sentence, serving as a stark reminder of the consequences of her heinous crimes.
Argues that Rogers didn't commit the crimes. Instead, Antoinette Frank duped him in a plot to rob the restaurant.
The manager of Mr. C's pool hall testifies that he saw Michael Lacaze at the establishment on March 4th. 2
clerks from the New Orleans East Walmart state that on March 3rd, 1995, neither Antoinette nor Rogers owned a 9, except potentially the gun Antoinette reported stolen from police lockup.
The trials and subsequent convictions of Antoinette Frank and Rogers Lacaze represented a significant moment in the history of the New Orleans Police Department. Frank's conviction was particularly noteworthy as she became the first female officer in the city's history to be found guilty of slaying a fellow officer and receiving the demise penalty.
By admitting he'd been with Antoinette Frank when she ordered food from Kim On. The order came in at 12:51 a.m.
On July 21st, 1995, the jury convicts Rogers Lacaze on 3 counts of first-degree murder.
Aftermath and later developments. After the tragic restaurant robbery slaying and the subsequent trials and convictions, several significant developments and events took place. Firstly, Officer Ronald Williams, who was slain in the line of duty, was laid to rest in Lake Lawn Metairie Cemetery on March 7, 1995. To honor his memory and sacrifice, his name was inscribed on the memorial wall at the National Law Enforcement Officers Memorial in Washington, D.C. This recognition served as a tribute to Williams' service and a reminder of the dangers faced by law enforcement officers. In the aftermath of the slaying, the Vu family, who owned the Kim An restaurant, initially kept the establishment open at the same location in New Orleans East for 10 years. However, in 2005, the restaurant suffered flood damage due to Hurricane Katrina.
But don't call on any of them to testify. Antoinette does not take the stand in her own defense.
The jury takes just 22 minutes to find Antoinette Frank guilty on 3 counts of first-degree murder.
She tells a forensic psychiatrist that her father displayed bizarre and physically threatening behavior.
And it was further affected by post-storm looters who stole jewelry belonging to Ha and Quang Vu, 2 of the victims. Consequently, Quoc Vu and his mother Nyet decided to sell the location and reopen the restaurant in Harahan, while also relocating their residence to Metairie, where they believed they would be safer. Another significant development emerged in 1995 of November, a month after Antoinette Frank received her first demise sentence. During that time, a human skull with a bullet hole was discovered buried beneath Frank's house. The skull was believed to be that of Frank's father, Adam Frank, whom she had reported missing in 1993. However, authorities did not make a serious effort to identify the remains, and the case remains under investigation. Legal proceedings surrounding Antoinette Frank continued, with her defense team raising various arguments and appeals. On October 18, 2006, her lawyers argued before the Louisiana Supreme Court that her demise sentence should be overturned due to the denial of state-funded experts to help prepare for the sentencing phase of the trial. They claimed that investigating Frank's background for potential mitigating evidence was necessary. Psychiatrists testified that Frank may have been affected by traumatic events during her childhood, potentially leading to her behavior at the time of the slaying and indicating a possible diagnosis of post-traumatic stress disorder. However, a psychiatrist retained by the state disagreed and affirmed a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial tendencies. On May 22, 2007, the Louisiana Supreme Court upheld the demise penalty with a 5-2 ruling. On April 22, 2008, District Judge Frank Marullo signed a demise warrant for Antoinette Frank.
Prosecutors theorized that Frank's motive for murder was her anger about getting cut out of the paid off-duty security detail at Kim An.
Who tried to help a troubled young man, Roger LeCarve, but ended up being forced to participate in his schemes.
The damning tape clearly shows Antoinette admitting to shooting Ha and Quang Vu,
scheduling her ending by lethal injection for July 15, 2008. However, in May, the Louisiana Supreme Court issued a 90-day stay of execution, effective June 10th, pending ongoing appeals. On September 11, 2008, a new demise warrant was signed by the same judge, setting Frank's ending for December 8, 2008. The defense team raised concerns about the limited time they had to review the extensive case records before the appeal deadline, leading to further legal discussions. The state Supreme Court ultimately voided the demise warrant in November of 2008. In September 2009, Frank's lawyer sought to have Judge Marullo removed from her ongoing post-conviction appeals, citing bias due to his previous signing of 2 demise warrants for her. However, Judge Lori White ruled in January of 2010 that Marullo should remain on the case. Frank's attorney planned to appeal this ruling to the state Supreme Court, which had already overruled Marullo's previous demise warrants. Surprisingly, another lower court judge ruled in October 10 that Marullo had to be recused from the Frank and Lacaze cases because of doubts about whether he had been transparent with the defense teams regarding his connection to the slaying weapon used in the restaurant slaying. Marullo had long maintained that his signature authorizing Frank to access the weapon from the evidence room was forged. It is worth noting that since the ending of Tony Joe Henry in the state's electric chair in 1942, no female has been executed by the state of Louisiana. After Antoinette Frank's appeal for overturning her demise sentence was denied by the Louisiana Supreme Court in 2007, her case continued to be mired in legal proceedings and appeals. Efforts were made by her defense team to challenge the validity of her conviction and sentence.
Antoinette also alleges he sexually abused her from age 9 to 19.
In November 1995, 8 months after Frank had been sent to prison on murder charges, the man's skull had a gunshot wound.
No attempts are ever made to ID the remains.
During this time, Antoinette Frank's defense team also raised concerns about Judge Marullo's bias, as he had previously signed 2 demise warrants for her execution. They argued that his involvement in her case compromised her right to a fair trial. However, Judge Lori White initially ruled in favor of Marullo, stating that he should remain on the case. Frank's attorney planned to appeal this decision to the state Supreme Court, which had already overruled Marullo's previous demise warrants. Another noteworthy aspect of the legal proceedings was the issue of state-funded experts for Frank's defense. Her lawyers argued that they were denied necessary resources to thoroughly investigate her background for potential mitigating evidence. They sought to uncover any traumatic events in Frank's childhood that could have influenced her behavior at the time of the slaying. Psychiatrists testified about the possibility of post-traumatic stress disorder and the impact of childhood trauma. However, psychiatrists retained by the state disagreed with these assessments and maintained a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder with antisocial tendencies. The ongoing legal battles and appeals resulted in delays to Frank's scheduled execution. Multiple demise warrants were signed and subsequently voided, leading to a prolonged process. Despite the efforts to challenge her conviction and sentence, the Louisiana Supreme Court upheld the demise penalty for Antoinette Frank. Overall, the aftermath and later developments surrounding the Kim Ah restaurant slaying were characterized by legal complexities, appeals, and controversies. The involvement of Judge Marullo and the challenges raised by Frank's defense team further added to the intricacies of the case. The legal process underscored the significance of ensuring a fair trial, addressing potential biases, and exploring all possible avenues for mitigating evidence.
Who lived with her at the time she reported him missing in September 1993. Most of us in law enforcement don't even see people like Antoinette Frank as police officers. They are simply
Exhaustion of appeals and execution. The cops' journey through the legal system following their conviction and demise sentence involved a series of appeals aimed at challenging the verdict and securing a reprieve from execution. These appeals serve as a critical aspect of the justice system to ensure fairness and the protection of the defendant's rights. The appeals process began shortly after the cops' conviction. Their defense team, armed with legal arguments and supporting evidence, filed appeals in higher courts seeking to overturn the conviction or reduce the sentence. These appeals typically focused on potential errors during the trial, such as improper jury selection, evidentiary issues, or constitutional violations. Over the course of the appeals process, the cops' defense team presented their case before appellate courts, which carefully reviewed the trial proceedings, scrutinizing the evidence and legal arguments put forth. These courts evaluated the fairness of the trial, the credibility of witnesses, the conduct of the prosecution, and the validity of any evidence presented.
Frank's defense team paints her as an innocent woman. Frank's defense team has subpoenaed almost 40 witnesses.
On September 12th, they recommend the death penalty, which the judge affirms.
Each appeal involved extensive legal arguments, thorough analysis of the trial record, and careful consideration of existing legal precedents. The defense team and the prosecution submitted briefs outlining their positions and engaged in oral arguments before the appellate judges. As the appeals progressed, the cops' legal team faced mounting challenges. The courts might have upheld the conviction and demise sentence, ruling that the trial was conducted fairly and the evidence overwhelmingly pointed to the cops' guilt. Alternatively, they could have identified errors during the trial but concluded that they did not warrant a new trial or a different sentence. After several rounds of appeals, the cops' defense team reached the point of exhaustion, where all available legal avenues for appeal were explored. The appellate courts had rendered their decisions and further appeals became unlikely to succeed. This stage represented a crucial turning point in the case as it marked the cops' last chance to avoid ending through the judicial process. At this juncture, the final decision to proceed with the ending was made. This decision was typically reached by a combination of legal authorities, including the state governor, relevant legal departments, and the correctional facility overseeing the execution. They carefully considered the cops' case, reviewed any additional evidence or arguments, and weighed public opinion, moral considerations, and legal obligations. The ending process itself is a solemn and highly regulated procedure. It typically involves a carefully planned series of events designed to ensure the humane and lawful administration of capital punishment.
including an incident where he killed a family pet in front of her.
which resulted in multiple aborted pregnancies. But many suspect they belong to Antoinette's father. His alleged abuse theoretically could have damaged her psyche prior to.
The specific details may vary depending on the jurisdiction, but generally, the ending is carried out within the framework of the law. The cop would have been placed on demise row, residing in a secure facility specifically designated for individuals awaiting execution. During this time, the cop may have been allowed to exhaust all remaining legal options, such as clemency petitions or requests for stays of execution. Once all legal avenues were exhausted, a specific date and time for the ending would have been set. The ending method would depend on the laws of the jurisdiction and could include lethal injection, electrocution, gas chamber, firing squad, or other approved means. On the scheduled ending day, the cop would have been transferred to the slaying chamber, a controlled environment designed to carry out the sentence. Qualified personnel, including medical professionals, correctional staff, and witnesses, would be present to ensure compliance with legal requirements. The ending process itself would be meticulously conducted according to established protocols. If the chosen method was lethal injection, the cop would be securely restrained.
Criminals who use their position to commit crime, it was the perfect recipe for. As a result of a dope deal gone wrong, Rogers Lacaze is en route to the hospital with serious wounds.
Over the ensuing 3 months, she chauffeurs him to look for work, buys him clothes,
And a lethal combination of drugs would be administered by trained professionals. The purpose of the drugs is to induce a painless demise. Following the execution, appropriate notifications would be made to the relevant authorities, the victims' families, and other involved parties. The cop's body would undergo standard procedures such as an autopsy before being released to their designated next of kin for burial or other arrangements. The execution of appeals and the subsequent ending represent the culmination of the cop's legal journey. While the process aims to uphold justice and respect for the rule of law, it often raises ethical and moral debates regarding the demise penalty and the potential fallibility of the justice system. The complexities surrounding the stage of the process highlight the gravity and significance of capital punishment as a society's ultimate form of punishment.
Against protocol, Antoinette lets Rogers ride in the squad car and even move it. Earlier, on the night of the Kim On shooting,
by the end of that night, Rogers had taught Antoinette more about being a criminal.
Impact on the government. The slaying of Antoinette Frank, a corrupt cop convicted of multiple slayings, had significant impacts on the government. Let's delve into some of these impacts in relation to her case. Number 1. Law enforcement accountability. Antoinette Frank's ending highlighted the government's commitment to holding law enforcement officers accountable for their actions. It demonstrated that no one, regardless of their profession, is above the law. The government's handling of Frank's case sent a message to the public and within law enforcement agencies that misconduct, corruption, and serious crimes committed by police officers will be thoroughly investigated and prosecuted.
Dema assesses the situation as a robbery gone wrong, especially after Chow informs him the money she hid in the microwave was gone. The gunman fired more than 9 shots at the siblings. Haas suffered at least 2 shots to the head.
Number 2. Public perception of law enforcement. The case of Antoinette Frank had an impact on public perception of law enforcement. While Frank's actions were those of an individual, her status as a police officer implicated the entire profession. The government's swift and thorough response to bring her to justice helped restore public trust by showing that the system could effectively address corruption within its own ranks. Number 3. Criminal justice reforms. Antoinette Frank's case may have prompted the government to review and reform aspects of the criminal justice system. It could have led to discussions about the selection and training of police officers, ethical standards, internal affairs procedures, and the need for improved oversight mechanisms within law enforcement agencies. Reforms aimed at preventing similar incidents and improving transparency and accountability in law enforcement might have been considered or implemented.
Rance asks Frank to recount the events of the evening. She admits to being at the restaurant earlier before the shooting to eat with her nephew.
as she was getting a drink from the kitchen, she heard gunshots coming from the dining room, which sprang her into action, ushering the employees out of the back door.
Rance asked Frank why she drove to the station to report the shooting instead of calling it in on a radio or cell phone. The question flusters Frank.
Kwok explains how he and Chow hid in the freezer, while Antoinette and her nephew ran around the restaurant yelling.
Number 4. Political response and policy debates. The ending of Antoinette Frank likely sparked political responses and policy debates. Public officials and lawmakers may have engaged in discussions about the demise penalty, criminal justice reform, police accountability, and the need for stronger measures to prevent corruption within law enforcement. These debates could have influenced legislative agendas and shaped policy decisions related to law enforcement practices, officer training, and oversight mechanisms. Number 5. Resource allocation and budgetary considerations. The government's response to Antoinette Frank's case required significant resources. This included funding for her legal representation, the conduct of a thorough investigation, court proceedings, and the logical aspects of the execution. The allocation of these resources and the associated budgetary considerations,
and rummaging through the area where the family usually stored the cash.
Neither Kwok nor Chow saw who pulled the trigger, which leads Rance to return to the dining room to confront Frank about her account.
And says he was in the car when she returned to the restaurant for the third time that night.
Antoinette says no, but when Demma pats her down.
Just before 4 a.m., as cops transport Frank to police headquarters.
Minutes later, officers surround the apartment of Lacaz's brother in Gretna. They take Rogers into custody without incident.
Would have impacted government departments and their priorities. Number 6. Impact on sentencing and appeals processes. Antoinette Frank's case may have influenced the sentencing and appeals processes for similar cases in the future. It could have set legal precedents and shaped interpretations of the law concerning crimes committed by police officers. The government's handling of the appeals and the final decision to proceed with the ending would have had implications for the administration of justice and the development of jurisprudence. Number 7. Impact on victims' families and community healing. Antoinette Frank's ending could have provided a sense of justice and closure to the victims' families and the affected community. It demonstrated the government's commitment to ensuring that those responsible for heinous crimes are held accountable. This may have contributed to the healing process and the restoration of a sense of safety within the community.
Chow and Kwok hid in the walk-in freezer when the shooting went down, but managed to see Antoinette and Rogers rummaging through the restaurant looking for cash.
Despite being on site for the shooting, Antoinette suspiciously reported the incident in person to her precinct. When questioned at the scene, she attempts to paint herself as a hero, but her story doesn't square with the evidence of Chow or Kwok's eyewitness accounts.
Final thoughts. Antoinette Frank's story is a chilling reminder of the potential for corruption and misuse of power within law enforcement. Her case shocked the nation, as it exposed the police officer who not only violated her sworn duty to protect and to serve, but also engaged in heinous crimes, including multiple slayings.
Possibly over Antoinette's off-duty security hours being given to Ronnie Williams. Rogers says Antoinette told him, "I'm going to get that mother effer,"
while he was standing near the doorway. Then she went into the kitchen and shot the others.
As her crimes were uncovered, the criminal justice system took swift action to ensure she faced the full weight of the law. The ending of Antoinette Frank marked the final chapter in a long and complex legal process. Her journey through the appeal system, the exhaustion of all available legal avenues, and the ultimate decision to proceed with her ending demonstrated the government's commitment to justice and accountability.
As she had her hands on Chow and Kwok, per their statements, as the first shots rang out.
Rogers says after they left, because nobody would ever believe she was involved.
Demma asks Lacaz what guns they had with them.
It showcased the system's ability to hold even those entrusted with upholding the law to the highest standards of conduct. The impact of Antoinette Frank's case extended beyond the realm of law enforcement. It had far-reaching effects on public perception, government policies, and the ongoing pursuit of criminal justice reforms. The case prompted discussions about police accountability, law enforcement practices, and the need for greater transparency and oversight. It also served as a reminder that no individual, regardless of their position or authority, is above the law.
Evidence lockup and reported stolen 2 weeks prior. This implies premeditation.
For the victims' families and the affected community, Antoinette Frank's slaying may have provided a sense of closure and justice. While nothing can fully heal the wounds left by such horrific crimes, knowing that the person responsible faced the ultimate punishment can offer some solace and the opportunity for healing to begin.
After briefing Antoinette on Rogers' allegations against her, she admits the night before the shooting, Rogers asked her about robbing Kim An. It was a bad idea because of the police presence, but took him there to get some food nevertheless.
Antoinette Frank's case stands as a stark reminder of the importance of upholding the integrity of law enforcement, holding officers accountable for their actions, and continuously working to build public trust. It serves as a catalyst for ongoing efforts to improve policing practices, strengthen ethical standards, and ensure that those who betray the badge are swiftly brought to justice. As society reflects on the story of Antoinette Frank, it is crucial to remember that her actions do not define the countless dedicated and honorable police officers who faithfully serve their communities. The case serves as a reminder of the collective responsibility.
Rogers insisted he needed something to drink. That's when she went back, knocked on the door.
He appeared at the back of the restaurant where she was and said several times, "Shoot those mother effers."
To foster a system that not only holds corrupt individuals accountable, but also works to prevent such misuses of power from occurring in the first place.
But Quan didn't die until Lacaze shot him multiple times to finish him off.
Lacaze took his gun back and they searched the restaurant for money. She insists he held a gun to her back the whole time.
And that's all for this video, folks. We'll see you next time.